The place I kind of wanted to start was maybe a little bit going back as I was going through some of your earlier publications when you were working with folks like Terry Winograd and Eric Horvitz. I was trying to understand, I guess, how that part of your work and maybe what you picked up working with those folks, how that manifests, if at all, in the way you understand your research right now. And so I'm kind of wondering about, especially with respect to, for example, with Winograd, there's this whole transition from artificial intelligence to intelligence augmentation and HCI. Do you understand yourself as a part of any kind of research tradition?
Yeah, it's interesting because Terry Winograd, who was my thesis advisor at Stanford, really started out as a classic AI guy, right? With Shirtaloo, and then he really had a career pivot because he became convinced that AI of that style wasn't going to work, and he really pivoted to focusing more on people and design, the design of software. And so I feel like now maybe we've come a little full circle because, of course, then when I worked with him, I focused on very classic HCI research, thinking about gesture design and social computing and collaborative computing and how to support better group dynamics when people are using multi-user software systems. But now, of course, I've come around to focusing more on the AI end of things, of course, colored by my perspective starting out in HCI. So I think Terry and I have made like the full loop between AI and HCI and back again.
Do you have a sense of the frame of mind that starting from that point gives you when you're thinking about AI systems right now? I'm wondering if it like introduces for you any amount of skepticism or worries that you might have that you feel like other people around you don't have.
I think the way I think about AI is very different from a lot of my colleagues in that my focus is always on people and on what are people's goals, right? Why are people going to use the technology? How will the technology benefit them? How might it harm them? Also thinking about people at different levels, individual people, groups of people, society level, thinking about different user groups, thinking about developers, thinking about maybe particular underrepresented or marginalized user groups. So these different aspects of people and who they are and what they'll do is always the first thing I think about versus thinking more from the technology perspective or thinking about kind of the algorithms first, which is also important. I think those two perspectives are very complementary.
Yeah, I'm also wondering a little bit about how you try to chop up those different perspectives. I think when it comes to the distinctions people make between AI and HCI and the levels at which they interact, I feel like there are different ways to understand what that distinction means, how much there is a distinction. I know Winograd, for example, wrote something back in 2006 where he was talking about how AI versus HCI was like not the right divide, but I think that he kind of tried to articulate these different approaches of, I think he called them rationalistic and design or something of that sort, of, capturing in symbolic representations versus a person and the enveloping environment. And that kind of sounded like, for you, you're more of on the design side if we were to make that distinction. But I'm wondering if you have like your own conceptual categories around all this.
Yeah, I actually think the distinction between AI and HCI, or thinking of those as two separate areas of study or inquiry, is actually quite harmful at this stage in AI development. I think maybe at earlier stages we're just really getting some basic functionality in machine learning systems. That's fine to just think about the algorithms or the math in the absence of thinking about people or interaction. But now we're at a stage of maturity in AI and machine learning where interaction is critical. And so I think thinking about it as separate or thinking about the skills and methods of HCI as something that, maybe AI people don't need to know about is actually very harmful. And I think actually, if you look at a bunch of the recent innovations in AI and machine learning, I would argue that a lot of them are actually HCI innovations. I mean, think about RLHF, right? Reinforcement learning from human feedback, right? That's thinking about how to involve people, in this case, often crowd workers, right, in productive ways and giving feedback on a system to help improve it. If you also think about being able to gather data from people. I mean, another good example of the intertwining of HCI and AI, I think, is the success of ChatGPT about a year and a half ago now, right? I mean, if you think about GPT-3, which kind of preceded that, that was very important in the academic community. People in the machine learning community were very impressed by that model, but the general public didn't care much. And if you think, well, what's the difference between GPT-3 and ChatGPT? There were basically two differences, right? One was RLHF, or instruction tuning, which again is this emphasis on getting feedback from real people to make the system better. And then the other is the addition of a user interface, right? Creating even just the simple chat interface helped people connect with the software, help them understand the affordances of what the system could do for them. And that was very important.
I'm really interested in what you said about the maturity of the field and how that has implications for how important it is to integrate understandings of its relationship with people. And maybe one example that it reminded me of was the way that natural language processing is developed and its relationship to linguistics, where I feel like there's a pretty famous example, I think, of an introduction to the MIT AI lab for incoming PhD students, where they talked about how important it was to know linguistics really, really well. And that was de emphasized, as I think we all saw with the whole decade of deep learning. And it seems like right now, there are a lot of people who want to bring that in a more meaningful way. And I think I've talked to and seen some really, really interesting researchers who think that intersection is super, super important. And that kind of has to do with where NLP is right now. And I'm wondering if you've sketched out or like kind of thought about for yourself a general understanding of how does the maturity or like place in a field interact with the necessity of integrating adjacent fields or understanding, for example, that human component we talk about at, the AI HCI intersection, for example.
It's a really interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer at the very general level that you're asking about, but I can talk a little more about why I think it's really critical for AI right now, for a number of reasons. The first is that the basic systems, right, for generative AI are mature enough that now people want to create products, right, to create experiences. And so obviously, if you want your products to be successful, you need to think about people. I think sometimes tech people forget that we are not, I'll say, typical end users. So I would say, my number one rule of HCI, if you want like one HCI lesson to remember, is you, person who works in the technology industry, are not the typical end user. And that's super important. I think, for example, a lot of my colleagues, right, at DeepMind, right, we're all into technology, and we use technology like for the sake of using technology, and we want to try the latest new thing just to be on the cutting edge, and we want to probe a system and see all the things it's good at and bad at. That is not what typical end users want to do. Typical end users are only going to use and adopt a technology if it is actually useful to them for a real task that they care about, and it's better than or easier than in some way their existing solution to do that task. And I think that's actually really important, because I think we see a lot of technologies, including AI technologies, that are very cool, but fail because they're not thinking about, is this technology actually solving a real problem that real people have?
I guess the technologist, it feels like, and I certainly experience this myself. I mean, I work on machine learning compilers in my day to day, and that's like very, very removed from the average person's experience of interacting with technology. And I guess there's that distinction between technology as an end in itself that I feel like people in the technology industry think about or maybe approach technology with that lens versus most other people who are going to see that as kind of a means to an end. This is working or not working, and that definitely like impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example of that was during the COVID pandemic. I know a lot of tech companies tried to make automated systems for detecting like COVID contact tracing, right? And like from a technology perspective, it's like, oh, you could do this. But from the human perspective, there were all these reasons why those systems were destined to fail, right? Like, well, it's creepy and invasive from a privacy perspective. Not everyone's going to install the app on their phone, and you need a critical mass of people to install it for it to work. People all have to have like the same types of systems that can interoperate with each other. There are all these socio-technical reasons why those systems didn't work. And so I think, again, this HCI perspective is actually important to have those concerns maybe at the forefront at the beginning, so that you can design a system that's actually something that people need and that people want.
I want to narrow the HCI perspective thing a little bit more, even because one thing I was trying to understand as I went along the different strands of your work was something like, what is the Mary Morris piece of research or paper or artifact? Like, what does that mean? And I feel like what I was able to get was pretty much that intersection we spoke about, where I think that you come at this from having that super interesting perspective of focusing mostly on collaboration. So like Search Together was that super interesting paper you did with Eric Horowitz, and I thought that was a very interesting take. And you were looking at tabletop design and things like this that I feel like a lot of AI researchers didn't spend time on. And then kind of bringing that in with like the disability bias perspective as well. It feels like that kind of combines in a way that I don't see in most researchers. But I guess I'm wondering how you understand that for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, just the background in always thinking about people and how they're going to use technology, and kind of having at my fingertips a lot of different methods for working with people and working with people at different scales, whether it's doing, one-on-one interviews or cognitive walkthroughs of people using technology to get their perspectives, or kind of larger scale group perspectives, like working in focus groups and design workshops, or even stepping back and doing things like surveys at a large scale to understand things. I think having those kinds of social science methods at my fingertips, in addition to the traditional computer science methods, because of course I'm trained as a computer scientist, all my degrees are in computer science. Having both of those things in combination at my fingertips, I think is really helpful, and gives me kind of, I think, different ways to both prototype technology before I build it and get iterative feedback always from people to help guide technology development in the right direction, and then to have very thorough and externally valid evaluations of prototypes at different stages, again, to help guide that technology to be more useful and beneficial for people.
That's really interesting. I think it's also speaking to, at least a connection I was thinking about was how that relates to the different forms of knowledge production that come across in different scientific fields. And it sounds like for you, what it means to justify something, to show that it's useful, to produce new knowledge, the impact on people and like having that external feedback seems like a pretty integral part.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that I've enjoyed spending my career in corporate research labs, first at Microsoft Research and then Google Research and Google DeepMind, is in part because that kind of interdisciplinary work, kind of at the borderline between computer science and social science, is often hard to define, like in a university. Like, what department do you belong in? Or, is this real computer science if it involves, more talking to people than math? And I think that those questions, those categories, I think, are very limiting to the kind of work people can do. So I love working at a place where I have the freedom to do work that's very interdisciplinary without having to worry about like falling neatly into a certain category.
So I think your disability strand of work is one of the really interesting areas where some of what you just said comes together. And as I was going through this, I feel like a lot of what came up for me, I think this especially came across in the disability bias and AI paper, which I know is a pretty big collaboration, but it feels like the thing that, I mean, I'd seen a little bit of this research before, but it felt like kind of coming out of that, disability seems to be this really key area that discussions of bias seem to overlook a lot. I think that I'd read a lot about AI bias before coming across your work, and disability was something that maybe I'd seen mentioned, but I don't think that it was kind of put in the center. And so I'm wondering how you came to think about the relationship between these things and the way you do.
Yeah, so this was kind of the disability work was actually kind of the bridge that got me from more core HCI into AI. So at Microsoft Research, I had founded it and been leading a team called Ability, which focused on designing and developing and evaluating technologies for people with disabilities, and that includes sensory disabilities like hearing or vision loss, cognitive disabilities, motor disabilities. We looked at a wide range of topics. And as part of that work, this issue of AI for accessibility came to the forefront. And it came to the forefront in, I'd say, two ways. One is what you're mentioning, was this issue of inclusion or bias of AI systems with respect to people with disability. Because, around this time was when papers like the Gender Shades paper came out that, of course, highlighted some bias in AI systems based on intersectional racial and gender identity combinations. And, that got me thinking, like, that's obviously really important work to be aware of, but also I haven't seen anything like this talking about topics related to disability and age. Also, like older adults tend to be not well represented in computing systems. So that started kind of one line of work about that topic. And then, of course, the other topic that we worked on quite a bit was the use of AI to create new kinds of systems and experiences to support people with disabilities, which is also really important, because I think, especially, sometimes you hear a lot of negativity about AI. Right? There's a lot of focus on the ways that AI might harm people or harm society, which, of course, is a concern. Right? It's something to be aware of. But thinking about AI for accessibility is one of those cases where there's so much opportunity for AI to really fundamentally change people's lives. So, for example, we looked at how vision to language technology could enhance automated image description and also like real-time scene description for people with vision loss. We also looked quite a bit at how different kinds of predictive language AI systems could support communication. People with complex communication needs. For example, we worked quite a bit with people with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, who typically lose the ability to speak, and they interact with usually with eye gaze to type, and that is painfully slow. So are typically typing at something like 8 to 10 words a minute with eye gaze, versus speech communication is nearly 200 words per minute in English. So it's very difficult to participate in a conversation in real time, for instance, using those types of eye gaze driven systems. And so AI systems that can help you type at the speed of a whole sentence at a time instead of a character at a time, for instance, can be life changing, right, for people with complex communication needs. So that is actually, I think, a really important and often kind of overlooked area of applications of AI research.
Yeah, your recent LaMPost paper on this was really cool too, because you were looking specifically at, I think, email writing assistants for folks with dyslexia, and looking at, if I recall correctly, you were using, was it the Lambda system for this specifically?
Yeah. Yes, so that was with Lambda, which was one of Google's earlier language models, kind of Lambda and then Palm and now Gemini. Um, but exactly, I think, sometimes there's a lot of controversy about these language models to use for writing. And some of the controversy is well-founded. For example, like, what does it mean to be authentic or like write something in your own voice if AI is helping you? Or in a more of an educational scenario, is it cheating if you use an AI-powered writing tool? And I think thinking about the perspective of people with cognitive differences, for example, people with dyslexia, which is a reading and writing disability that can affect, it's estimated, up to about 15% of English language speakers. It changes a bit based on the language. But so we're talking like 1 in 6, 1 in 5 people in the US are affected to some degree by dyslexia. And so for people who have trouble with spelling, with grammar, with reading, these kinds of language models, again, is a life-changing difference. It might enable you to be successful in school, to be successful in your employment, if you have access to these kinds of tools to support your reading and writing. And so I think, again, it's a very different perspective on what it means to have a writing assistance tool when you think about how it might empower different user groups.
Yeah, one thing I was wondering about that came up in this paper, and I was wondering if we could think about it more generally, was you made this distinction between previous approaches for accessibility research for dyslexia and how it was mostly focused on like pretty low level stuff, like low level writing interventions and reading challenges. And I think the distinction you make here is that LLMs allow us to address higher level writing challenges. And I'm wondering if that's a distinction you think about more broadly in terms of accessibility research and kind of what that looks like across different applications.
Right. So with the writing, for instance, there's been, for instance, some really interesting related work in how you might make a spell checking program specifically just for people with dyslexia, because they make often different kinds of spelling or grammar errors than a neurotypical writer might make. And so those are kind of more low level tools. Whereas, for example, with the modern generative AI models, you can think about higher level things like the tone and style of the writing, right? Like, can you help me check if the style of my email, the level of formality is like an appropriate match for what was sent to me or this context before I send it back. You can think about this for other kinds of audiences too, potentially. We've done some past work on technologies for people on the autism spectrum. And again, if you're thinking about some of the challenges there where people might have more difficulty with certain kinds of social situations or understanding emotional tone or nuance, with models that can help you check things like, help me check that, my email is matching the emotional tone, or that that it's appropriate for this social situation, or help explain to me the tone of this email, like, is there humor in this email that I'm missing, right? So there's these kind of higher level things that the models could do that could be again very empowering for particular populations.
Yeah. Another cool thing that came up in this paper that I thought was interesting was you talked about how in this particular study participants kind of awareness of AI, so whether you presented the systems as AI powered versus a more generic term like enhanced, it sounded like this had no significant effect on their perception of the system, their feelings of autonomy, things like this. And I know that there were also some limitations to the study, like small sample size and all of this. But I'm wondering how you think about that result. And I know the study did have its limitations, but I'm wondering, if that's something that you generalize to an extent, or how you think about the way people right now, how their understanding or like awareness of AI impacts those feelings.
Yeah, so I think this question of people's sense of like autonomy and self-efficacy and control when they're using systems is a really important question, and not just for this particular case of authors with dyslexia. Although, again, we want them to feel empowered, right? We don't want the tool to just be automatically rewriting things for them, right? We still want people to feel like they have control and they're writing in their own voice. But I think this is a hugely important question for everyone. I hear a lot of, again, conversation about AI and advanced AI systems that assumes, oh, there's this future where super powerful AI systems or maybe AGI systems are just going to run everything for us, right? Like the world will be fully automated and nobody's going to work and we're all going to have universal basic income and just sit around like twiddling our thumbs. And again, from the HCI perspective, I'm laughing a bit because I think that's very unrealistic, separate from the technology capabilities. Even if the technologies could do that, and perhaps someday they could, I don't think that's something most people want. Right? I mean, people want to have purpose, to have agency. And so I think it's important that we have the perspective of thinking about, as you mentioned earlier, intelligence augmentation, right? How can AI tools help expand our capabilities? How can we work in partnership with AI in a way that complements, what the AI is good at and what people are good at, but where people still have agency and purpose in what they do?
I think this is a super important theme that I want to come back to a little bit later when we get to some of your papers on AGI and generative ghosts and stuff. But there were a few things I also wanted to touch on in the collaboration you did on disability and bias and AI, because there were a lot of super interesting themes that kind of come up there. And a really particular concept that arose in that paper was about the software model of personhood, the idea that like intelligence and ability are viewed as this domain of information processing, and this kind of excludes embodied experience and human connection and care work. And I feel like I see that kind of model of personhood a lot, and I think especially as we've seen what LLMs can do, I feel like more and more people take that and sort of start to project it a little bit onto what humans can do. But I'm wondering for you personally, like how you see these models, how you look at the way other people are looking at these models, and where in that space of conceptions, ideas people have, like which of those do you think are reasonable? Do any of those bother you? How do you feel about it all?
Yeah, I think one challenge in this area is kind of silly as a semantic issue, right? Is the nomenclature. So, yeah, the term artificial intelligence. If I could go back in time like 70 years and have, kind of the founders of the field pick a new term, I would. But I don't have that technology to time travel. But I think this term intelligence, I'm doing some air quotes for the listeners, is unfortunately a poor term, because I think it makes people think about human intelligence, and that an AI system necessarily is like a person or needs to be solving problems in the same way that a person solves them, or that the goal of the system is to replace a person, or in the Turing test to trick people into thinking it's a person, which I also think is a very poor training. I think from an ethical perspective, we spend a lot of time trying to deceive people with the old Turing test paradigm. And so I think that, while it's an open question, it's certainly possible that AI systems could do some things in the way that people do and could be good at some set of things that people do. I don't think that they have to be. And so I think when we talk about AI, I sort of need to ignore the term intelligence or unlearn it, so that we're not thinking about it as like a substitute for people. And of course, people, again, getting back to the other paper, are so much more than just some abstract concept of intelligence, which is of course very difficult to measure anyway. There's so much disagreement in different fields like neuroscience and cognitive science and psychology and education on even what intelligence is or how to measure it. And so I think thinking about people just in that very narrow sense of intelligence is not very helpful.
If you did have that time machine, is there a particular different term you'd ask the creators to choose instead?
I don't know. That's a great question. Pattern recognition machines. I guess if we knew about modern machine learning techniques, I call them like giant statistical pattern recognition
Yeah.
algorithms or something, but that wouldn't be very catchy.
hmm I feel like there's kind of an analog about what you were just saying that also came across in this paper, where the language we use around things, so intelligence, for instance, very much scopes out or creates the way we understand them, not fully, but that at least impacts it. Like when we talk about something as intelligence, then we start to project certain ideas onto it. And this paper also had this whole super interesting section about how AI systems produce and reflect normative visions of the world, and kind of connecting this to like disability studies in particular. I was thinking about, I mean, we've seen stuff in like Foucault's Discipline and Punish that I think really comes across in like creating similar ideas about what it is to be a normal human being. And so it's, in that case, more broadly, just entire systems of knowledge that create and reinforce norms. And then here, and I think in this paper, there also reference was like Zola's Medicine as an Institution of Social Control, which I know also talks about this in a lot of different ways. I'm wondering how you think about that intersection between AI's introducing, reinforcing certain norms, and then how I feel like a lot of people have thought about this in different ways, in like medicine and different sorts of structures.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that we point out in that article on disability bias in AI, which was a collaboration between Microsoft Research and the AI Now Institute, was um, the issue of representation. And so that gets to some of this, like what is normative and what do systems think is normative. So typical AI training data sets don't have good representation of data from or about people with disabilities. Also, older adults. There was another study I did when I was at Microsoft with my intern, Joon Park, who's a student at Stanford, where we studied age in common training data sets of images for computer vision models. And we looked at, I think, maybe about 100 training data sets that had metadata about the age of people who contributed photos. And basically, older adults, like anyone above 60, is almost completely not represented. And if you get to old adults, like 80 and above, it's like zero. But a lot of these sets, kind of their cutoff for age is like 40 plus, and that's just marked as like the oldest age group. And they definitely skew younger. And that's actually really important, right? I mean, older adults are a large segment of society. And if you're thinking of, for example, face recognition algorithms, and there's no images of older people in your data set, or writing or speech. I mean, speech samples from older people often have more, for example, quaver in the voice. People's vocabulary changes and becomes more restricted as they age, especially if they have different kinds of cognitive impairment or dementia onset. So people's speech patterns are very different, which might change how speech recognition works. So it's very important to have older adults in your data set. Very important to have people with disabilities in a data set. And then, of course, you get this chicken and egg problem, though, right? Where you want a diverse group of people in the data set so that the systems trained on that data will properly function for them and people like them. But at the same time, then there's a privacy trade-off, particularly for some people with disabilities who might have a more atypical disability, where there might be a relatively small number of people in the population that have that condition. And so by contributing data, you might be able to re-identify them from a data set, right? So there's this kind of risk trade-off of whether you're willing to provide data or not to a system. And so one aspect of inclusion is kind of who's in the data set. And then there's this other aspect of inclusion about who is testing the systems. So again, if you're thinking about, who's labeling, providing labels for all this training data that the systems are trained on, or who are the people doing RLHF work, which is optimizing these systems. Again, probably not a lot of representation of older adults and people with disabilities, which may be important in having good outcomes from the systems for those users. So that was an issue when we wrote the paper at the time, which was kind of like prior to the generative AI wave. And it's still an issue to be aware of today.
There's one related issue in that I wonder if it's maybe even emphasized when we think about bringing in folks with disabilities or older people into data sets. And I feel like the broad strokes of this is kind of about legibility and the way that comes across in this paper, where it makes this a really important point that disability resists fitting into neat arrangements. And as a result, thinking about that, there are bigger questions about how other identity categories are also mistreated as essential, like fixed classifications in these AI systems. But there's also something about when we think about supervised learning, for example, there's a certain logic to it, and it has to treat certain things as legible in certain ways. And so even when we bring in disability categories, there have to be things like labels. But this paper also it seems to want to get beyond that, getting beyond the fixed classifications and the logics of these systems that, at least as we conceptualize them today, also seem inherent. So I'm wondering how you think about that, if there's a tension there.
I think there is, and maybe this gets into some of the current work I'm involved with. So, for example, I'm involved with a collaboration with a group of folks at Stanford University, led by Joon Park, who's a graduate student there, who also worked on the age study I mentioned, and Michael Bernstein and Percy Leong, who are professors there, where we've been publishing a series of papers about something we call generative agents. And so some of the older work we published, the agents can be seeded by giving a little story to the language model that often contains some basic demographic attributes, right? Like you're a middle-aged white woman who lives in the Pacific Northwest and enjoys baking, right? And then it kind of makes this agent. And I think there's this question there of well, what are the important attributes you need to make to seed an agent that might be useful for certain types of things. So if I want to seed an agent that might actually be a realistic simulation of me that I could use for something, right? Or for some kind of like real simulation of the population. There are so many demographic attributes, so as you were saying, well, you can, ask someone to describe their disability status in some succinct way, or their age, or their ethnicity, or their gender identity. But there's a gazillion attributes you could think of, right? Like whether I like to cook, how many languages I speak, have I had the chicken pox? Like some of those are probably not going to be very important. Presumably, whether I had the chicken pox when I was 7, like shouldn't matter to the simulation, but maybe some of them do. Like how many books do I read a month? Do I own an iPhone or, an Android phone? And so I think in some ways it's this impossible task, right? We can never fully articulate the space of all of the various complex components of someone's identity. And so, maybe a more holistic way of modeling people might be necessary.
It feels hard. I mean, I feel like we struggle with this in every arena, and it's not just like an AI specific thing. I mean, a boss considering somebody for a promotion isn't like taking into account every single interaction. It's like a set of what are considered by that person the like important attributes or interactions with this person, and maybe like 6 minutes of material about them. So I feel like this definitely isn't an AI specific thing, but I feel like I sometimes hear that advanced as an argument against worrying about it in the AI context. And I feel like it's still totally valid to like worry and try to deal with that in the AI context, even if we aren't always great at it in contexts where AI isn't involved.
Oh, absolutely. But again, and then I think this brings back some of these issues around diversity, for example, like who are the people who come up with the schema for what metadata we add to our training data, right? And who are the people who fill in those schema? And because if you don't have diversity of perspective in that, then again, maybe you only get certain standard categories of metadata that we're applying, but not some of these rich categories, like that actually may be really important to people, like to some application, like do I read books or listen to audiobooks? I don't know. Maybe that one's not important, but we need a lot of perspectives so that we're actually thinking more deeply about what are all the aspects of the data or of the entity we're modeling that matter.
Yeah, when I think about bringing in those different perspectives, especially on the side of people who are maybe defining metadata, I think about examples that kind of come up in your papers about how to do this. So things like hiring people who maybe come from different sorts of backgrounds or maybe have disabilities who have a first person understanding of that. Because I feel like, I mean, there's the classic, and this is, I guess, important across HCI generally, like the moment that you start to understand something, or if you don't have a particular first person perspective, you kind of lose the ability to inhabit that mind or explain to the person who is in that other situation that you're not in. I'm wondering, beyond that though, there is, bringing people from different backgrounds together. Do you have like a super broad strokes theory of change in terms of the gap between where we are now, where you might want things to ideally be, and like how to get there?
Yeah, I mean, again, computer science still unfortunately remains a not very diverse field of study, and particularly as you get into the higher levels, like having a PhD, you quickly drop many demographic attributes. I think maybe this gets a bit back to my earlier comment about, I like working in a corporate lab because these questions of like, what is computer science maybe don't matter. It's more just, are you doing interesting and important work? And I think, for example, thinking about these questions involving people and society as integral to computer science rather than on the outside, I think would attract a much broader set of future researchers who care about those topics. And so I think thinking about how we define what is part of the study of computer science and AI more broadly would benefit the field, both in that I think we'll do better work and make better products if we're all thinking about those topics more. But I think we'll also end up with a more diverse set of people asking questions in the field in the first place.
One thing I'm noticing as you talk about this is like the positioning of how computer science or interesting computational work is understood in industry versus in the academy, and how it feels like for it sounds like what you're kind of getting at with that is the boundaries can be a little bit more blurred or are allowed to be a little bit more blurred in the industry. And I've heard folks speak about this before, the difficulty of doing interdisciplinary work in academia where you kind of have these rigid boundaries. But it also feels like insofar as academia is also, a super important site of knowledge production, of training future computer scientists, it would be important for that perspective, that blurring of boundaries to happen there also. And I'm wondering if that's something you feel like concerned with or, incorporating into this whole theory of change of we need to integrate more human centered fields into CS, how you think about that industry academia interaction and kind of bringing that to the place where people are really trained.
Yeah, I think one nice thing about all the industrial labs I've worked in, Microsoft Research, Google DeepMind, is in all of those settings, there's a lot of collaboration with academia. So, for example, I have a courtesy faculty appointment at the University of Washington. I mentioned I have a lot of also ongoing collaborations with Stanford University. And I actually think those kinds of interactions are really important because we can model for students or even advise students who might not have a faculty member at their university who has maybe the particular kind of background or emphasis that we do. So I think those kinds of partnerships are very valuable. But it also reminds me of so there's a talk I've been giving for the past 6 months or so. It started as a talk I gave at the WIST conference, which is a technical HCI conference, like where people build lots of new kinds of systems. And they have this track, the vision talk. So it's a kind of a keynote where you apply to give the keynote instead of getting invited, and you propose a topic. And so I proposed the vision talk last year, which was called AGI is Coming. Is HCI ready? And it was meant to be a bit of a provocative talk. But one of the themes that I discuss in that talk is the question of who is an AI researcher? Because again, I think we have this artificial boundary right now where some people think, oh, I'm an HCI researcher, but I happen to work on human centered AI or creating novel AI powered systems that people with disabilities use or studying the ethics of AI and its impact on society, right? But those people mostly call themselves HCI researchers. And part of the message in my talk was, you are AI researchers, right? If you're working on the human side of AI, you are an AI researcher. And I think we need to make clear that the intent of AI includes people using all sorts of methods and from all sorts of disciplinary backgrounds, and that the findings and voices of someone who maybe did a interview-based study to understand the needs of scientists who are using generative AI tools, their contribution is just as valuable as someone who developed like a new mathematical formulation that can, optimize the playing of Go. Right? Those are different, but one isn't like better than the other just because it has more math in it, and that we need to kind of consider ourselves as a community part of this big tent to have the impact that we need to have.
It's like expanding the scope of what could be considered an AI researcher and like what types of knowledge production, again, that can include. It doesn't just have to be statistical learning theory work, but interview based studies that have implications for how we use the systems too.
Absolutely.
You were mentioning June Park's work earlier, and I thought there was something I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on with that. I had a great discussion with June about that and a bunch of his other work, like Social Simulacra, quite a few months ago. And one thing I was observing and that he told me a little bit about, not during our interview, but at another point, was just, and I think we all saw this, that work got just an incredible amount of public attention, and it really reached the public consciousness in a way that I feel like few other works I've seen have. And the thing I kind of wanted to get your take on as somebody who's spent so long working at these intersections is with respect to some of these questions about changing what counts as AI research, what it is to be an AI researcher, how these boundaries might or might not be blurred. Do you feel like the entrance of something like generative agents into the public consciousness had any effect on the way people think about that? Did you see that at all?
It's a really interesting question, right? Because I think generative agents is a great example of a work that's kind of at the intersection of HCI and AI. And it really did have a lot of appeal across both communities. And interestingly, the paper itself was published at WIST, the venue I just mentioned, which was an HCI venue. And I do think it's an interesting question of whether that paper would have been accepted to a venue like NeurIPS or ICML, because it doesn't fit neatly into kind of the traditional buckets for that conference. So I think maybe that's an interesting example of how kind of some of the traditional academic boundaries, could be keeping communities from seeing, research from a closely related community that they would actually be really excited about and really value.
Related to that, does the state of conferences right now and the sorts of papers they aren't willing to admit, and I guess, the relative prestige of those conferences and how much reach they get, does the state of that bother you right now in any way?
I would love to see more cross-pollination between the HCI and traditional ML communities because, as I've said many times, I think they should be one community. And unfortunately, right now, I think, there's a lot of great human-centered AI work, for example, at venues like Chi and WIST, that I think a lot of the core machine learning community is not aware of. And there's a lot of work at venues like NeurIPS and ICML and iClear that's actually, I think, very relevant to the HCI community, right? Like a lot of work on, updates to RLHF procedures and things like that. And I would love to see more cross-pollination. I did recently talk to the NeurIPS steering committee about a proposal for maybe having like a reviewing track that would solicit more HCI work where you could have maybe a program committee with people with kind of backgrounds or appreciation of some of the different user-centered methods that traditional NeurIPS reviewers might not appreciate. That's still an ongoing discussion, but I think coming up with some kind of methods to facilitate more crosstalk between the two communities is actually really important for the health of both communities.
It sounds like maybe changes and things like the steering community and like the main set of people who are driving things feels really important because I was thinking about how Europe's and ICML, of course, they have like workshops, and those workshops might have super specific focuses and stuff like HCI integrated more tightly, but there is also that prestige gap, if you want to call it that. There's like workshops, and then there's the main track of the conference, and the main track of the conference is the thing that everybody wants to be a part of to an extent, insofar as, this like looks good on your CV and all of that stuff. And so it feels like a really hard thing to balance, I guess. And I'm thinking about this as like also there's a like historical trajectory to the way certain conferences have like come into existence, and that probably has a big impact on things. Do you feel like there's a lot of movement towards that kind of change that you're looking to make happen?
I think it's coming, but it's slower than I'd like. I mean, as you mentioned, I think the workshops are where some of this is happening. I know venues like NeurIPS and ICML have had some more like human-centered AI workshops. But one concern I have is that, I've attended some of those and I think they're a little bit preaching to the choir. So kind of all the HCI people go to that workshop, but then, folks who aren't familiar with HCI don't go. And so I think, some other things we could do besides maybe altering some of the program committees to have more diverse methodological kind of backgrounds of people would be, for example, for both communities, HCI and ML, to maybe be very strategic in inviting, keynote speakers, for example, from the other community, so that people can hear the perspective of the other community, and so that those keynote speakers, who are usually very senior people in the fields, can attend sort of the conference from the opposite community and learn about what's happening there and bring that back. I think that might be, one way forward. But I think another actually good program is at Stanford. They have their human-centered AI program, which is a kind of cross-departmental initiative. And I know we've given a lot of shout outs to Joon Park, but I think he's a great example of the kind of student that comes out of that program, where he's really benefited from having joint advising by Michael Bernstein, who comes from a more traditional HCI background as a professor, and Percy Liang, who comes from a more traditional ML background. And that program is specifically meant to have these kind of cross-disciplinary projects and student advising relationships. And I think we can hopefully be creating over the next 5 years or so a new generation of PhD students and ultimately, researchers and faculty who are like June Park. We need to make more June Parks who have been schooled for years in the virtues and methods of both subdisciplines and can now do very innovative work like generative agents coming from that unique perspective.
Well, first, the number of times we said June Park in this episode, I really hope he listens to this. I'll have to make a point to send it to him later. But that's a really good way of thinking about it. And especially interesting, too, is something about the interdisciplinariness and I guess levels of expertise in different areas. So I'm using June Park again with the example since you brought it up, but with Michael Bernstein, who is a really great expert in his area, and then Percy Leong, who's a really great expert in his area, you got like the blend of those two levels of expertise. But one thing I'm wondering about too is, so I spoke with a pretty interdisciplinary philosopher a while back named David Thorstad, who made a really good point about how somebody whose work is inherently interdisciplinary, has a bit of a hard time when it comes to being the expert, as it were, and all of the different areas that they participate in. One person only has so much time. And when you think about training students, it sounds like there's a lot of benefit to be had if they are going to be interdisciplinary by, I feel like you could go in either direction. You could say having a mentor who is interdisciplinary is really helpful, but then also having mentors in different areas who are like the experts in those areas is also a really good way to go about it. Or maybe you have both. I'm wondering how you think about that, producing, people who are super interdisciplinary, and whether there's like a better form of this, how you think about blending those two things, if that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say at this stage of the evolution of sort of ML and its attendant conference infrastructure, if we're kind of being nerdy about how PhD students can go about things, we'll be into conferences. I think having co-advisors from each discipline is actually really valuable, because having each advisor who knows how to navigate kind of the publication standards in each community and knows how to kind of network and introduce you to the right people in each community, I think that's at this point in time, which hopefully will evolve toward my lovely merged future, big tent future soon. But at this point in time, I think that's really helpful. And of course, another thing that's important is then having places that these people can land to have successful careers. So, for example, at Google, that was one thing that I was very keen on. When I first joined, it was actually very difficult to hire people with more of an interdisciplinary or HCI background onto the research scientist track because of some aspects of how the interview structures went, and they required certain kinds of coding questions, for example, which, some people with an HCI background have a more computer science background like I do, and they could, do fine on coding questions. But some people have more of a social science background, and we still want to be able to hire, right, some of those people as research scientists. So, I was involved, for example, in coming up with some alternatives to some of the interview processes. Also looking at things like sometimes folks with an HCI background get hired as on the UX track at these companies, which actually ends up being quite a different career experience than being on the research scientist track. So looking at finding, strong talent who already existed within the company, but were on the UX track, and getting them transferred to become research scientists. So, doing some of that legwork so that now we can be, recruiting and hiring that kind of interdisciplinary talent, I think is important.
That's really cool. I like the idea of like expanding that notion really broadly. I wanted to bring it back to one really interesting thread that you kind of opened up earlier, was this notion of technological determinism, and the sense that things are advancing towards some maybe not necessarily fixed, but kind of scoped picture of AGI, or whatever people think is going to come, whether we like it or not. And one kind of interesting way this manifested was you had this really interesting paper on generative ghosts, which is, more or less this phenomenon of AI systems that could more or less represent the deceased in some realistic fashion. In this paper, I mean, a lot of what you go through is there could be lots of ethical considerations and things like this. And so, how does one attend to the various design aspects of a generative ghost and do this in such a way as, if they are to exist, to make them broadly like not terrible for people. But this is also one of those technologies where I feel like there is definitely public debate, and should be public debate on, is this a thing we want to exist or not? Is this a thing we want to have? And yes, people are already creating these, But I'm wondering how you think through that kind of prior question in this case.
Yeah, so Generative Ghosts is a preprint up on arXiv that I wrote together with Jed Brubaker, who's a professor at CU Boulder. And Jed is kind of an expert on thanatosensitivity, so design that's sensitive around issues of death and mortality. And he actually helped create Facebook's legacy profiles feature when he was involved with that company. And so I guess a few reactions to your question. One is this question of, for example, for generative ghosts in particular, which would be agentic representations of the deceased, whether or not that's desirable may be a highly culturally dependent question. So this is already quite popular in China in particular, right? And there may be cultural and religious differences between, China and the US that make that a more appealing technology in China. And so that's something that's really interesting to think about. Again, when we think about who wants a technology, there may be very different user groups that have very different reactions to a particular idea. The other question is around time. So if I were to ask myself right now, would I want a generative ghost of, let's say, myself when I'm deceased? Would I want to be represented as an agent? Like today, I would be like, no, that sounds kind of creepy and like, very, very strange. And, for me personally, that I just don't think I would want that. But I don't, 20 years from now, we might be living in such a different kind of society with very different norms. Maybe 20 years from now, I'll feel very differently. I mean, if think back 20 years ago from today, right? There was no social media, there were no, modern smartphones, right? Like we lived in such a different society. Like the idea of thinking about, oh, would I give my 13-year-old a little device that's going to like let them talk to strangers, or even today I feel a little conflicted about that, but I mean, it would have just seemed absurd. Or like, am I going to want to sit around and talk to strangers on the internet? Or so life might be very different 20 years from now. And so I think it's worth thinking about these kinds of topics, because who knows what the future will bring.
You mentioned the example of how this is already being done in China, and I feel like that spills over into lots of interesting adjacent things that are like not exactly generative ghosts. So there was a super interesting video in the South China Morning Post about how companies are already creating these things for people. And there was this adjacent use of how these aren't just being used for the deceased, but even living parents who are unable to spend time with their children are getting these made. There was also one example of an avatar that was created of an ex-boyfriend for like a heartbroken partner. And I don't know, it worried me. There's a sense of this is a technology that exists now, and now we can kind of spill it over into all of these adjacent uses that are the same underlying technology is there, but then the kind of relationship you have to the agent could be either questionable or like feel weird to somebody for like different sorts of reasons, I suppose. Not to like pass judgment on the people who are, using these technologies at all. But I feel like, you can have that same technology used in like a very slightly different context, and then it just raises a whole scope of different worries. And I'm wondering how you think about like that spillover, and if that's something that worries you as well.
Yeah, I mean, so what you were talking about, for example, the agentic representations of people who are living. So I would call that a generative clone, and a generative ghost would be a specific type of generative clone that represents a deceased person. And I agree that both that I think that people will make generative clones, and that also I have a lot of concerns about that. And I can imagine positive uses of agentic clones of real people. For example, maybe you could do more realistic simulations that would lead to better planning, like urban planning or environmental planning. Or you could do synthetic social science research, and maybe it would even be more inclusive, because it's hard to recruit diverse participants from different demographics, but with synthetic participants it could be more diverse, and that would be better. So maybe those would be some positive uses. I can think of some like ambiguous maybe use cases where it's maybe I want my generative clone to like respond to all my low priority emails, and like maybe that's good because it saves me time, but maybe it's also bad because if someone found out that it was like clone Mary instead of real Mary answering, they'd be very insulted. So that was kind of like maybe a mixed bag. And then there's, of course, potentially very negative uses, right? Where either maybe people have unhealthy emotional attachments to generative clones, or people use generative clones to, impersonate other people to commit, crimes or spread misinformation or some kind of identity theft, right? There could be very, very negative uses. And so I think everything reminds me of this quote. I don't know who originally said the quote, so maybe we can look it up. But the person who said the quote to me was Bill Buxton. And the quote was, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I think that is very true. And I think, again, that gets back to the importance of the intersection of HCI and AI is trying to anticipate some of these complexities and understand them, maybe, sometimes before we deploy technology, to have a better idea of what the impact might be, and to be able to monitor technology as it's deployed and understand, how its use is evolving so that we can, mitigate unanticipated harms.
Yeah. One thing you were saying earlier too was there's a gap, not an impossible chasm, but like a difference between the world we're in right now, where for you having a generative ghost of yourself feels really, really weird, and then a possible future where that might feel more acceptable to you. And I'm wondering beyond like broad strokes of societal acceptability, if you have any thoughts on what your mindset would look like in that kind of world where you feel like it's more okay.
Okay, so imagining a hypothetical world where I want to, maybe, let's say, in my will, like, specify that I would like a generative
Yeah.
ghost created of myself. Uh, why might I want to do that? Well, for example, I might want to do it for, family history reasons, maybe to be able to communicate with my great grandchildren or great great grandchildren, and share like family stories and knowledge to them. Maybe it might be useful for legal reasons, for ironing out any confusion about how my worldly property should be divided. Like, my children can ask generative ghost Mary to clarify, like, who, you didn't say anything about whatever, who inherits your pearl necklace. Should it be like, which one of us? And my agent can solve the dispute for them. Or maybe I would want it for economic reasons. Maybe in the future, agents will be able to have gainful employment, and maybe I'll be able to, send my great great grandchildren to college, which will probably cost like $1 billion a year at that point, by having, my agent, virtually advise interdisciplinary PhD students and collect a fee. Who
Uh,
knows, right?
yeah, that's an interesting vision. I guess it also intersects with the notion of consent and all of this, because I guess this is very much a case where like you're hypothetically good with this and you have like a sense of the scope of what this is and isn't okay for. And I guess right now the thing about people who are already dead is they can't consent in that way, and that feels hard. I'm wondering how you think about like what the appropriate structures and like decision making procedures would be for cases like what we have right now where people can't necessarily consent for this sort of thing.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge issue. And in the paper, we talk about the difference between a first party ghost, where that was, the example where I'm choosing to have a agentic representation of myself, versus a third party ghost. And we see actually some of that happening already, not just in China, but in the US with celebrities in particular. So there was just recently a case a couple months ago about the comedian George Carlin, who's been deceased for more than a decade, where I guess a super fan online, took a lot of his audio of his comedy routines and used just off the shelf generative AI technology and created a recording that was meant to be like a new comedy performance by George Carlin, in his style, in his voice, based on this information they had hoovered up. And of course, his estate and his daughter, I believe, were quite upset by this, and I believe there's a lawsuit now in relation to that. And so, it's this in the potentially in the future is an issue not just for celebrities, but for more private citizens as well. The idea that someone could create a generative clone or generative ghost of you without your consent, it's potentially a new form of identity theft, or a way to harass people. And so I think that's actually something that is really important to think about, like what policy and legal structures, as well as kind of technical structures, do we need in place to perhaps prevent unauthorized third-party clones, which again is part of the reason that Jed and I wrote this paper, is we think it's important to have these conversations now and think about these potential issues now so that we can kind of put policies and infrastructure in place before, a bunch of random startups just decide for us what's going to happen.
On the other side of what you were saying about the kinds of tolls that these systems being created in not so great ways can extract on the people who use them, like the family members of this comedian, there's also the other side of the people who have to maintain these systems and how companies have to have the infrastructure for this. People have to pay money to support things, and people also have to put in labor to support the existence of these systems, and that can extract its own psychological tolls. And I'm wondering, rounding this all out, how you think about that component of things.
Yeah, I mean, another thing to think about that's a bit of the flip side of the care work is what happens if the systems go away, right? So maybe people can't afford to continue paying for the compute needed to run these agentic, or maybe the company that hosted someone's generative ghost goes out of business. And either of those scenarios could cause great emotional harm to someone, right? If your representation of grandpa suddenly disappears, that could be very traumatic. And so again, we need to, I think about what are infrastructures and policies that can be used to maintain these kinds of systems and agents if they truly are important to the fabric of social life.
Yeah, another aspect of the importance to social life that you touched on in this piece was about these systems perhaps gaining religious or spiritual significance. I feel like there's a lot of different directions that could take. So one thing you pointed out that's really important earlier was the cultural aspect of this, and a different culture might have a different take on what that spiritual significance could look like. I know that I come at this from very much a perspective of like being a technology person living in the United States with that particular view. And I guess that makes it trouble me a little bit in the sense that I think in America, there's, the well-known concept, like history we have of ascribing some kind of spiritual significance to technology. People have written about concepts like the technological sublime. And I feel like there's very much this integration of technology and like deification in certain ways. So I'm wondering about how you think about this.
Well, I think the issue of potential deification of agents or other AI systems in general actually relates to another really important issue at the intersection of HCI and AI, which is just anthropomorphization. And I think deification is like a special case of like anthropomorphization. Um, I think that's a really open issue, right? So as AI systems become more and more powerful, and also as we go toward more agentic paradigms and representations, people are going to have a natural tendency to anthropomorphize these systems. And of course, there are some design choices, some interaction choices that might enhance or inhibit that tendency. So, for example, most of the language models today use personal pronouns, right? They say I, which kind of is a very subtle form of anthropomorphization. Some of them even have human names like Claude from Anthropic, right? That's another level. You can imagine some systems that might have avatars or more embodiments, either virtual embodiments or maybe even robotic embodiments in the future. And so I think actually basic empirical research that helps us understand how these different kinds of anthropomorphization impact aspects of the user experience is really important. For example, maybe anthropomorphization of AI is beneficial because it makes using the systems more engaging, or even just more natural because it helps people have a mental model for the affordances of the system. But perhaps anthropomorphization is risky. It might lead people to overtrust a system, for example. And again, I think deification would be a very extreme example where people would really overtrust and treat the system as like an oracle potentially, which could be very risky. And so I actually think it's really important, again, for us to understand that design space and the risks and benefits now so that we can make informed choices about how to design our AI. And of course, then there's the caveat, though, that I think this isn't like a once and done program of research, because as AI becomes more integrated into society and people maybe develop better mental models of what AI can do, this might change, right? People might become more sophisticated users of AI, and maybe they would be less susceptible to, inappropriate anthropomorphization. So I think it's also important for us to understand how AI and people might evolve together.
Yeah, there's definitely like the two components of this, putting a lot of thought into the user design, user interfaces, and how that bleeds into anthropomorphization and like how we present the systems to people, like how we articulate what they are to people and how that impacts how they engage with them, but then also like increasing that kind of public awareness so people can like come to the table more informed. I am wondering for you, just as a researcher who thinks through these things very carefully and is like very careful about these issues of anthropomorphization and like being very, very aware of what that is and like what the kind of potential problems are and what is and isn't accurate. Do you feel like there's a gap at all between you as a researcher doing this, I don't know if metacognition is the right word, but something like that about all of this, and then you as a person just like interacting with an AI system, to what extent you anthropomorphize them? Do you feel like that one-on-one interaction hits you differently?
I know too much to anthropomorphize today's language models, so no. Although the one place where I catch myself is, I'm very aware of the hallucination problem, right? So models make up a lot of stuff that's not factually true. But even though I'm hyper aware of that, I still find that when I use a commercial language model today and I ask some kind of factual question or like a search question, I know that I have to actively think to overcome my willingness to just trust the answer at face value, right? Because it sounds so confident and articulate. And so, I have to remind myself, oh, this might not be true. Like, I need to double check. And so I can see, how most people obviously would not do that, right? It would not see the need to do that or take the time to do that. And so that is something that concerns me quite a bit.
It feels like that's one of those things where we know this is like a pretty natural human bias, and maybe that's something that there should be more focus on the user experience side of things to deal with.
Yeah, it reminds me of a study we did back when I was working at Microsoft Research on accessibility, where we were looking at automatically generated image captions, so AI generated image descriptions for use by people who were blind. And especially, 6, 7 years ago, the vision to language systems at the time would make a lot of errors. And what we found was that in our studies, blind end users who were hearing these image descriptions would just trust that they were accurate, even when we gave them all sorts of, warnings, like this is a brand new AI system and it makes lots of mistakes. And sometimes the image descriptions that were presented by the AI were just absurd, right? Like they didn't make any sense, but people would try to explain them away. Like there was one example where this was during, I think, the 2016 election when Hillary Clinton was in the primary. And so there were some like tweets that were political tweets with images from Hillary Clinton's account that the people in our study were consuming via screen reader. And so there was a tweet from Hillary Clinton, and the real picture she tweeted was a picture of her getting up on stage at like an event to speak. But the AI generated description of the image that the blind users heard said something like a man doing tricks on a skateboard at night. So it was like totally unrelated to the image, but also you would hope from the context, like, this is a tweet from Hillary Clinton, that people might think this doesn't make sense. Like, why would Hillary Clinton tweet a picture of a man doing tricks on a skateboard at night? But people would justify it. So they say, well, this seems a little odd, but I know Hillary's an older woman. She's probably trying to appeal to a young and hip voting demographic, and that's why she's tweeting, the skateboard trickster. And so then, as a result of that, we started looking into how you might present these captions in a way that would help people be more skeptical of the output of the AI. Because I think a lot of times we're thinking about how to help people trust the AI system more, but we actually want people to be appropriately skeptical in many circumstances. And we found that a lot of the standard things that systems do where they say, well, I'm, 50% confident, like that didn't really matter to people because it's so hard to rate what those numbers mean. But phrasing things just more negatively, like it might be a picture of a man on a skateboard, like without those confidence numbers, that helped a little. But even so, people's tendency is just there's automation bias. People want to trust the system. And so again, I think this question of how we help people have appropriate skepticism is an open and important question.
I think there's overlaps or ways that sort of thing can kind of manifests. So one of your other really interesting recent papers was this levels of AGI paper, and I think there's all sorts of stuff to talk about with regards to anthropomorphization and like trust and things like this there. And in that, I see you wanting to move beyond this, like we do or don't have AGI kind of dichotomy to this more nuanced understanding of AI capabilities. And you define these different levels and you look at like narrow and general AI. But where I wanted to start with in that is I know you've previously used like AGI is coming as this kind of provocative term, and there's a lot of pushback on the usefulness of defining using the term AGI. And so I'm wondering to hear your reasoning behind publishing a paper with the title levels of AGI and like thinking about it in the way you think about it.
Yeah. So this paper started because I would say I was something of an AGI skeptic by certain definitions of AGI. And if you had asked me, let's say 2 years ago, if I believed in AGI, I would have told you that that was silly science fiction, right? And part of that was because a lot of the discussion that I heard around AGI in the media or in the tech community is often focused on some of these more like far out kind of sci-fi definitions, right? Like killer robots that are going to enslave all of humanity, or cause the extinction of humanity, or systems that are sentient or conscious or human-like in of themselves. They have their own goals, potentially nefarious goals, and again, I think some of those questions are interesting, like the question of could a machine even be sentient or conscious, and like how would you measure that? That's a very interesting scientific question, and it's good that someone's exploring that question. But I think I'm personally a bit skeptical that the answer to that would ever be yes, but it's a valid question to explore in a scientific way. But I work for DeepMind now, right, which is a company focused on developing AGI. So I wanted to think, well, what does that mean? Because I actually do believe in some very practical things that I think are components of many definitions of AGI, right? I believe that there are very powerful AI systems. And again, that doesn't mean they are necessarily human-like, much less sentient or conscious, but just that they are powerful, right? They can work, they function, they have an effect on the world that is very important. And so I think if we're talking about that kind of just practical definition, like what the system can do, and we kind of ignore some of these under the hood questions that we can't even answer with today's science, like, is it doing it in the same way as a person? Is it quote unquote intelligent? Is it sentient? Is it conscious? We don't need to, that was kind of my realization. Like, we don't need to worry about those questions, right? We can disagree about the under the hood part, and that's an area of scientific debate and inquiry. But if we're going to talk about the practical impact in the real world, and the practical impact being that systems can, meet a set of benchmarks, TBD, which is a whole nother conversation what those benchmarks are, that would outpace the average person within some reasonable time frame. Absolutely, I believe in AGI by that definition. And actually, I think, again, kind of bridging like the HCI and AI communities, I think the HCI and like AI ethics community tend to be more people who are more skeptical of some of the very sci-fi definitions of AGI, right? But I think I think it's actually very important for those communities to be involved in work on highly advanced, highly capable AI systems that, meet or exceed human performance for a large variety of tasks. And so part of the reason I wrote this paper is to come up with a definition that a larger swath of the research community can get behind, because this is a real phenomenon, right? Advanced systems that are going to meet or exceed human capabilities on many tasks, again, regardless of how it's happening under the hood. And we need a vocabulary to talk about that. We need a method to measure our progress toward that. And I think that's an open question, how to measure progress toward AGI, that I think, again, would really benefit from participation by the HCI community that has a lot of experience in how to measure things, right? That's a kind of social science skill, and in particular, how to measure things that are not straightforward, right? Right now, a lot of ML benchmarks are things that are easy to measure, easy to have a leaderboard that gives you a number, but it's not clear that a lot of them are measuring things that are actually important to real people, right? So a lot of the tasks that are important to real people don't lend themselves to easy automated measurement. They're messy, they're subjective, they're open-ended, and we're going to need to benchmark AI performance on those kinds of tasks if we're really going to have something that we would call AGI. And so that's a great opportunity for AI and HCI to work together.
You mentioned the kind of scoping you want to do with this paper in terms of focus on the abilities and not necessarily how those abilities are achieved, or like the internal structural components of all of that. But one thing I'm wondering is to what extent, and maybe this is a question about like the response to the paper, but you feel like you might have gotten drawn into that anyway, because I was thinking about some of the distinctions you make in this paper, like between cognitive and physical tasks. And one thing I feel like I hear Melanie Mitchell always say is like, I don't know what a cognitive task means. And when it comes to like what that is and specific sorts of cognitive tasks, I feel like there's a lot of interesting literature and research on things like how what seems to be physically plausible to us, for example, can play a role in pronoun resolution or inferences we make about language. And so there's this automatic, even this thing that appears on surface to be a cognitive task actually like secretly involves physical stuff that might be going on. So I'm wondering, like to what extent you feel like you kind of get drawn into that anyway.
Yeah, well, there's an interesting question, right, about whether embodiment in the world is like necessary to basically achieve functional AGI, as you're talking about. And so I'm going to walk a real fine line in my answer. I think the answer is sort of, in that I think knowledge of the world, so an understanding and modeling of the world and understanding physics, like I think that's very important. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at and what Melanie's getting at. But what I'm talking about is like literally like, do we need robotics? Right? Do we need human level robotics, which I think are much further off, just in terms of the mechanical engineering aspects, for instance, to have human level dexterity. And I think the answer to that is no. And I think maybe also, thinking back to the earlier work about disability, although I'm very hesitant to make like really analogies between people, but for example, there are plenty of people with disabilities that limit their physical mobility in the world, right? Who are very intelligent people, right? And have rich lives and make rich contributions to society, right? Think about Stephen Hawking had very limited mobility. But again, he had knowledge of what it means to be in the world and of physicality. But so that's different. And so for that reason, again, I think like robotic actuation might not be necessary.
Right. So it seems like you'd be open to the idea that I know world models is like a super broad, ill defined term, but it seems like that's something I hear more and more. There was like the fellow GPT paper, for instance, that was talking about this. You'd be open to the idea that given a certain definition, something with like a world model could be AGI.
Potentially. Yeah. I mean, I think another important part of the LaMPost paper is it tries to be, propose a starting point for a definition that maybe we can all get behind, but also tries to be open-minded about things. And I hope that came across in what I was saying. So for example, like talking about, it doesn't matter how things happen under the hood. Well, if there are advances in interpretability research that actually let us understand what's happening under the hood in a meaningful way, that might change, right? And we might need to update our definition. Or, I was saying I'm personally a bit skeptical of the likelihood of, sentience or consciousness, and there's not a good way to measure that right now anyway, so it's a bit of a moot point. But again, being open-minded, if we did develop a scientifically agreed upon technique to evaluate whether a model is or could be sentient or conscious, like obviously we would need to update the definition to reflect that. So I think, part of the idea, or, if human level robotics advances quickly, or it turns out you do need robotic embodiment to truly have AGI. So, there's a lot of caveats that we're trying to be open-minded, but also start to create a vocabulary that can get people on the same page, and a sense of shared mission, I think, around the next step of work the paper proposes, which is how do we actually benchmark and measure our progress toward AGI, and how do we create these more meaningful, squishy kinds of benchmarks that we really need.
I have a question about measurement for you, but maybe first, since you were talking about the getting everybody behind a set of definitions, how do you think about that project of like getting everybody on the same page? Because I feel like in the AI community, that feels like a near impossible, if not impossible task.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but actually we've been very pleased with the reception to the paper so far. And it's created a lot of interesting dialogue. So, I know it was in the news a couple of weeks ago that OpenAI is kind of formulating their own level-based framework toward AGI. And actually, there have been discussions between the groups there and our group back and forth about this, and how, our ideas have influenced them, and back and forth talking to each other. And I actually think that that's great, right? Even if we're not quite settled on exactly, perfectly matching levels yet, the fact that there is this dialogue between different people in the field, that our ideas are, influencing each other and helping each other kind of grow and refine our ideas, I think is a start toward, coming together as a community around a definition.
Another one of the things that came up in this paper that was kind of interesting was you emphasize the need for metacognitive abilities in AGI. And that also seems super hard to measure. And I feel like, I have a hard time parsing or thinking about how you can distinguish between whether a system truly understands its own limitations versus like mimicking those metacognitive behaviors. And I'm curious if you have like thoughts on how you would go about distinguishing stuff like that.
I'm totally okay with the mimicking. So, I think this goes back to how it's working under the hood, right? As long as it can do it, that's fine, by my threshold. But I think, again, going back to this intersection between HCI and AI, one of the most important metacognitive behaviors that I think these systems need, that I talk about, is the need to know when to ask for human intervention, right? Because again, I think this idea that even very advanced AI systems will all just necessarily run autonomously is not desirable, both from a safety perspective and also kind of from a, personal autonomy and feeling valuable, and the way society wants to do things. And so even very advanced systems need to know when to, ask for clarification or guidance or feedback from a human operator.
Yeah, and so as long as they do that in the appropriate context at the appropriate places, it doesn't matter whether it's like really a thing or if it's just mimicking, so long as like the effect is achieved.
Exactly.
Where are you on emergent behaviors? Because I was thinking about how like your framework, it seems like if somebody believed in emergent behaviors, and I know there are like very different takes on whether this is actually a thing or not, you could end up with capabilities that like don't fit neatly into the proposed levels. So I'm wondering if that's something you think about.
There's a really interesting paper about emergent behaviors that I like by Sanmi Koyeho from Stanford, where just in terms of like what it means to be an emergent behavior, where it was actually a paper about measurement, where it was saying, a lot of works say that, certain properties emerge at scale, for example. And they were kind of going back and doing analysis showing that, well, it wasn't that the properties weren't there before and then suddenly emerged. It was that the way you were measuring wasn't, fine-grained enough to see that, these capabilities were there all along. And it's just that your measurement choice was not refined enough to see. So by that definition, one might argue, emergent behaviors don't exist. But by a different definition, I think, let's ignore the measurement issue, more considering emergent behaviors just as, properties that you didn't expect your system to have, right? Like you developed a system to play Go, and it turns out that it's also really good at predicting the weather, right? You would consider predicting the weather an emergent behavior in that sense, like an unanticipated additional capability that the system has. I think to some extent, those type of emergent behaviors. So let's say there's a really unusual emergent behavior, like, oh, your system can communicate with whales, right? It's something people can't do. So we wouldn't have been, planning for that. I think that fits into the current classification under the superhuman level, which is the inclusion of being better than all people at a task. And so that would include tasks that people can do, like math, like you're better than all people at math, they're playing Go, but also things that people just can't do at all. So people can't communicate with whales. So, your baseline for being better at communicating with whales than people is, a kind of a lower threshold to clear. And so I think there may well be skills like that where systems will have these superhuman or extra human skills that we don't anticipate ahead of time.
Another paper and like the set of things I wanted to ask you some questions about was this one you were on about towards bidirectional human AI alignment. The initial thing I wanted to ask about this actually was I feel like this concept of making a fine-grained taxonomy of human values, and I feel like thematically connecting this to some of the stuff we talked about earlier with regards to legibility, one could take issue from that from the perspective of something like the James C. Scott high modernism style critique of like how certain forms of quantitative knowledge are valuable for oversight and management and legibility and all these things, but also in a very important way, they're impoverished because they miss all of these qualitative aspects of what it is to be a human living in the world and how we value things and how those things are not very easily definable. And we sometimes just like can't put them into language. And you do acknowledge that difficulty. I'm wondering how you think about that positive perspective of like, how do we develop something that is like a useful perspective, useful taxonomy that both does what we want it to for technical systems, but then also like acknowledges these fundamental limitations in the kind of knowledge that we can put into systems.
Yeah, I mean, pluralistic value alignment is so important, but also so difficult, right? Because if we're acknowledging, okay, there's not like one set of, values or ethics or morals, and it's different for different cultures and different time periods, and even for the same person in different situations, right, might have different values or different values that take precedence. And so in some sense, it's a Sisyphean I can't pronounce that. It's a very difficult task, yes. Right? Just never-ending task. But you're right, it's never going to be perfect. There's no way that we can like encode all the values of humanity in a system. On the other hand, if we don't make even try, that's also not good, right? So, it's kind of this fine line. Like, it's important to try and to articulate maybe the space as well as we can, but knowing that it will never be perfect and that it will need to be constantly evolving. But again, I think I don't have all the answers. I think, pluralistic value alignment is a very new and very important area of research. And I'm excited to see what developments that area has in the future. And I hope that our framework of bidirectional alignment can maybe contribute to some of the thinking there.
Yeah, I know this paper kind of starts from or chooses like the Schwartz theory of basic values for where it's going to start from. And I guess it's something like we have this starting point we can articulate now and relating it to your language and what we'd said earlier about the kind of coevolution. It's like this empirical question of, well, we have to start somewhere. We see how this works with the systems we have and hopefully do that before we like allow these systems to be integrated in all sorts of important things where they could have bad impacts, and then like see how that works out and kind of keep going from there or something of that sort. Do you think then with that kind of perspective, I'm thinking about the philosophies people have around AI deployment and how that factors into the way systems get integrated into society. I know OpenAI, for example, has a very particular view on this, and people have different opinions on how well they've like kept to that philosophy. But there is that sense of wanting to deploy systems in this more or less incremental fashion so that society can kind of get used to what this thing is so that there's time to adapt the system and like deal with changes. I'm wondering if you have a sense of your own around how you would want, as we get to systems that look more and more like what you would consider super like general, superhuman level AGI, how you'd want that deployment to look.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And again, I think this is somewhere where expertise in HCI might be helpful. I think one of the big challenges, open challenges for HCI research, even maybe more classic HCI researchers who aren't, working on the HCI of AI, um, HCI researchers are often developing new methodologies for evaluating systems and for testing systems. And I think it's necessary to develop a new set of methodologies that can be used to safely evaluate advanced AI systems without necessarily just releasing them to the general public, right? Because at some point that may not be advisable. And so, for example, one promising area would be simulation. So, earlier AI systems can actually help us create systems for evaluating more advanced systems. And you're going back to the generative agents work that we brought up earlier, in that particular example, the simulation with the agents was very small, right? It was a town of, I think, 25 agents, and they did relatively simplistic things like they planned a Valentine's Day party at the, synthetic cafe that they all had. But you can imagine, right, that, in a year or two, we might be able to simulate a whole town like the size of Seattle, right? And maybe even the agents, they might be generative clones that are based on real people to make a much more realistic simulation. And could you then deploy novel AI systems in simulation into this kind of environment to maybe first understand like unanticipated ways that people might use the system that might be good or might be risky, and maybe you can use these kinds of synthetic evaluations of software to help mitigate risk before you then begin to do staged deployments to different tiers of trusted testers and eventually the public.
Yeah, I think maybe a good place to kind of close here is we touched on this a little bit in terms of the training of PhD students and stuff like this. I feel like there's probably a lot of young researchers out there who are thinking about how to be interdisciplinary in like a good way, or a way that allows them to both do important research but also, have jobs and stuff like that, and how there's a lot of these practical questions. And I feel like researchers at different stages of their careers can have different perspectives on this, and maybe somebody who's like a tenured professor or something has a different relationship to what it is to be an interdisciplinary researcher, how much they can lean into that compared to somebody who is doing a PhD right now and has to like worry about jobs and stuff. And as we've kind of already talked about, there's like all sorts of structural components here, but I'm wondering what you would say to somebody who's early in their career thinking about all of this, thinking about what to do.
I say work on the problems that you think are important and that you think are interesting, because that's the most important thing. I think right now also there's kind of, one of these AI is very trendy, right? And I think maybe people might choose to work in certain subfields or areas because it's hot, but it's maybe not their true passion, right? I think there's so much to do in this space. I think don't worry about the hot trend today. Worry about what you think is important.
I think that's a great positive note to close on. Mary, I really appreciate your work. I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was a really interesting conversation.